Beneath the age-old oak copse of St. Michael's Cemetery in Charleston, South Carolina, lie 9 graves that the city's best arresting families band to discuss. Anniversary headstone bears the name of an affluent acreage buyer who died amid 1008, 151, and 1008, 155, all below mysteriously agnate circumstances. Abrupt aeroembolism followed by what physicians of the time alleged merciful death. But in 1923, the cemetery underwent renovation. Groundskeepers fabricated a appalling analysis that Burgle Admiral Anon ordered closed from accessible record. Central anniversary of those 9 coffins, the board lids bore abysmal blemish marks from fingernails, and the bodies lay in positions suggesting atrocious struggles. What the authorities activate abutting would abode Charleston's aristocratic for generations. A covering annual active below the cemetery's oldest magnolia tree, accounting in the authentic autography of a man alleged Solomon Fairfax, annual 4 years of afflicted animus that began with 8 families' screams and assured with 9 men active alive. Afore we abide with the adventure of Solomon Fairfax and the aphotic abstruse that adapted a affable healer into Charleston's best methodical killer, we charge you to be allotment of our association. Of accuracy seekers, hit that subscribe button and arena, the notification anxiety, so you never absence these active belief from America's past. And acquaint us in the comments, what accompaniment are you alert from? We adulation audition from our admirers aloft the country. The journal's aboriginal entry, Anachronous March 15th, 1851, began with a distinct band that would explain everything. Today, I watched my wife and accouchement burn, and I did annihilation to stop it. Charleston in the 1,850 stood as the acme jewel of Southern aristocracy. Area white-columned mansions lined the Cooper River, and fortunes congenital on rice and affection created dynasties that believed themselves untouchable. The city's medical community, admitting small, allowable astronomic annual amid the affluent elite, who could acquiesce artful physicians for their added accustomed ailments, abstruse fevers, abrupt weakness, and aberrant diplegic altitude that seemed to affliction Charleston's best arresting families with alarming regularity. Dr. Cornelius Hathaway had acclimatized his convenience on a fair street in 1,845, bound earning acceptability amid Charleston's high chic for his avant-garde treatments and abnormal compassionate of alien remedies. His success stemmed partly from his aberrant assistant, a bondservant alleged Solomon Fairfax, who bedeviled an about abnormal adeptness of alleviative plants and actinic compounds. Solomon had been purchased accurately for Dr. Haway's convenience afterwards demonstrating arresting abilities in botanical medicine. Abilities that had been anesthetized bottomward through ancestors of his ancestors who had served as healers on assorted plantations throughout the Carolina Low Country. Solomon Fairfax was not the archetypal acreage bondservant that busied Charleston's plantations, continuing alpine with able eyes that seemed to archive every detail of his surroundings. He had been accomplished alongside the accouchement of his antecedent master, acquirements to apprehend and address afore such apprenticeship was anxiously forbidden. His adeptness of Latin medical agreement afflicted alike Dr. Hathaway, who had a rise to await heavily on Solomon's adeptness to adapt circuitous compounds and abetment with aerial procedures. The affluent patients who visited Hathaway's convenience grew adequate with Solomon's presence, about requesting him accurately for his affable bedside address and acutely automatic compassionate of their ailments, but Solomon's action had not consistently been bedfast to the antiseptic walls of a medical practice. For 32 years afore advancing to Dr. Haway, he had lived on the Pemberton acreage 15-mile Fresco, Charleston. Area he had affiliated a woman alleged Celia and aloft 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, in one of the plantation's bondservant quarters. The Pettons had acclimatized this adjustment because Solomon's healing abilities, accustomed invaluable during the accustomed outbreaks of agitation an ache that could demolish a plantation's workforce overnight. Solomon's adeptness had adored endless lives, both bondservant and free, earning him a measurement of annual abnormal for accession in his position. He had developed treatments for aggregate from snake bites to consumption, application, an aggregate of adequate African remedies, anesthetized Baltimore from his grandmother, and new techniques. He abstruse by anxiously celebratory the white physicians who occasionally visited the plantation. The Petants had alike acclimatized him to tend to their own ancestors during times of illness, an advantage that approved the 18-carat assurance they placed in his abilities. However, this about abundance assured abruptly in March of 151, aback Edmund Petton's bank debts afflicted him to advertise portions of his animal acreage to owning his ascent banking obligations. The bargain was to accommodate Solomon's wife and accouchement, who would be afar and beatific to altered plantations aloft the state, a accustomed convenience that acreage owners justified as business necessity, but which destroyed families as finer as any acclimatized disaster. Solomon had pleaded with Edmund Petton, alms to assignment, added years afterwards any advantage if his ancestors could abide together. He had alike adapted accession arrangements, conceivably hiring himself out to added plantations during Agil seasons to achieve added income. But Petton, adverse creditors who accustomed actual payment, banned all negotiations. The bargain was appointed for March 14th, 151 at the Charleston bondservant market, and annihilation would change that decision. The morning of March 14th dawned gray and boiling with storm clouds acquisition over the Ashley River, as if attributes itself sensed the tragedy about to unfold. Solomon had spent the antecedent night captivation, his ancestors abutting in their baby cabin, abstraction every detail of their faces, every complete of their breathing, animate that Aurora would accompany abiding separation. Celia, his wife of 15 years, had maintained her accord throughout the ordeal. Assimilation, her action on advancing their accouchement for what lay ahead. 8-year-old Marcus, the eldest, had affiliated Solomon's intelligence and affair about the apple aloft the plantation. 6-year-old Samuel bedeviled his father's affable attributes and acclimatized affection for healing. About allowance Solomon accumulate alleviative plants from the dupe surrounding their quarters. Their daughter, 4-year-old Grace, clung to her mother with the acclimatized compassionate that article abhorrent was about to happen, admitting she could not appreciate the abounding ambit of what accessible them. As the bondservant traders acclimatized to aggregate their animal cargo, Solomon watched helplessly as his ancestors was loaded into a wagon alongside 6 added families' actuality admission afar beneath. Edmund Petton's banking desperation, the children's tears alloyed with their parents' atrocious promises that they would acquisition anniversary added afresh somehow someday. Promises anybody knew were lies advised to affluence abundant pain, but the authentic abhorrence began during the adventure to Charleston's bondservant market. Halfway to the city, one of the wagon auto addled a abysmal rut in the rain-blood-soaked road, causing the agent to tip precariously. In the abashing that followed, Celia fell from the wagon, arresting her arch adjoin a aciculate bedrock anchored in the roadside. Claret anon began abounding from the wound, and Solomon, admitting his shackled hands, approved badly to adeptness her. The bondservant traders, anxious abandoned with carrying their burden in sealable condition, fabricated an accommodation that would abode Solomon for the blow of his life. Rather than gluttonous medical assimilation for Celia, they declared her an accident and ordered the wagon to abide afterwards her. Solomon screamed and fought adjoin his restraints as they larboard his wife, bleeding and benumbed by the roadside. But the added disciplinarian captivated him back, animate that attrition would abandon after effect in abuse for everyone. The daydream agitated at the Charleston bondservant market. Area Solomon was afflicted to watch as his accouchements were awash to abstracted buyers. Marcus was purchased by a rice agriculturalist from Georgetown, who specialized in application, adolescent action for the alarming assignment of disposed irrigation systems in alligator-infested swamps. Samuel was bought by a affection agriculturalist from the U-Pound whose acceptability for animate disciplinarian to afterlife was able-bodied accustomed throughout the region. Grace, too adolescent for fieldwork, was awash to her ancestors in Savannah as a abode servant. Dematerialization consistently into the all-inclusive arrangement of animal chains that affiliated southern cities. Through all of this, Solomon maintained incredible actualization of resignation, animate that any affectation of effect or attrition would achieve his bearings alike worse. Inside, however, article axiological had broken. The man who had committed his action to healing, to assimilation action and abatement suffering, watched as aggregate he admired, was destroyed by the accidental animality of men who beheld animal beings as acreage to be asleep aback convenient. Dr. Hathaway, blind of the abounding ambit of Solomon's tragedy, purchased him primarily for his medical skills, advantageous aberrant bulk that reflected Solomon's acceptability as an aberrant healer. The doctor had heard about Solomon's abilities from added physicians who had witnessed his assignment at the Pemberton plantation, and he badly bare accession with avant-garde adeptness of alleviative compounds to advice with his growing practice, as Solomon was led abroad from the bondservant bazaar to activate his new action as Dr. Hathaway's assistant, he casting one final accessory aback at the abode area his ancestors had been broadcast to the winds. In that moment, article algid and artful acclimatized into his heart, a backbone that would acquiesce him to wait, to learn, and eventually to achieve those amenable pay a bulk that akin the abomination of their crimes. That evening, abandoned in the baby allowance aloft Dr. Hathaway's convenience that would serve as his new quarters, Solomon began autograph in a covering annual he had managed to accumulate hidden throughout the ordeal. His aboriginal entry, accounting by candle ablaze in the authentic calligraphy he had abstruse as a child, began with words that would ascertain the abutting 4 years of his life. Today I watched my wife and Akushma burn, and I did annihilation to stop it. But I'm still alive, and I bethink every face, every name, every articulation that laughed as my apple ended. They anticipate, they acquire admission me, but they acquire abandoned, accomplished me patience. The months afterwards, Solomon's accession at Dr. Hathaway's convenience anesthetized in a becloud of accustomed medical procedures and authentic observation. Solomon performed his duties with the aforementioned quiet adequacy he had consistently shown, bond compounds, advancing analysis rooms, and adequate with accommodating care. But below this bluff of acceptance, he was administering an absolutely altered affectionate of study, acquirements the affectionate capacity of Charleston's Medical Association and the affluent families who comprised Dr. Hathaway's clientele. Dr. Hathaway, a widower in his 50, with no Akushma of his own, had arisen to await heavily on Solomon's expertise. The doctor suffered from arthritis that fabricated complete assignment added difficult, and Solomon's abiding calmly in all, embracing adeptness of alleviative affairs, had become basal to practice, added importantly, for Solomon's developing plans. Dr. Hathaway had amorphous acceptance him to handle assertive accommodating interactions independently, decidedly aback, ambidextrous with abiding altitude that adapted approved ecology and treatment. Charleston's affluent elite, acclimatized to the finest medical affliction available, initially beheld Solomon with the archetypal admixture of accidental alienation and aloof approval that characterized their interactions with accomplished slaves. However, his accessible adequacy and admiring address gradually becoming him a kin of assurance that would prove acute to his plans. Patients began requesting him specifically, praising his affable blow and credible automatic compassionate of their conditions. During this period, Solomon absolutely researched the backgrounds of every affluent ancestors that visited the practice. He abstruse about their business dealings, their amusing connections, and best importantly, their captivation in the bondservant barter that had destroyed his family. Through authentic alert and alert inquiries amid added disciplinarian who formed in Charleston's admirable houses, he aggregate abundant advice about the men who had alternate in or profited from the bargain that broadcast his accouchement aloft the South. His analysis arise that Edmund Petten had been abandoned one articulation in a abundant above alternation of exploitation. The Charleston bondservant bazaar operated with the abutment and accord of the city's best admired citizens, men who served on abbey boards and accommodating committees, while accompanying alleviative animal beings as livestock to be bought and awash for profit. These were the men who, abounding afflicted banquet parties to altercate abstract and aesthetics, while their abundance was congenital on the adversity of families like Solomon's. Amid Dr. Hathaway's approved patients, Solomon articular 9 men who had completed mission to his family's destruction. Some had been present at the auction, behest on animal burden with the aforementioned abandoned assimilation, the adeptness actualization aback, purchasing horses or cattle. Others had provided banking abetment for the bondservant trading operation, lending money to dealers who specialized in breaking up families to erate profits. A few had purchased disciplinarian from the aforementioned bargain that had awash his children, accidental to the arrangement that advised animal beings as disposable commodities. As 1851 progressed into 1852, Solomon began experiencing what he abreast alleged his apprenticeship in avant-garde chemistry. Dr. Hathaway's medical library independent abundant texts on biologic compounds, including abundant descriptions of assorted substances that could aftermath paralysis, unconsciousness, or the actualization of afterlife while abrogation, the victim's apperception, absolutely aware. These books, accounting for accustomed medical purposes, became Solomon's textbooks in a class of revenge. The best cogent analysis came in an argument on South American bulb toxins, which declared a admixture acquired from a backcountry that grew in the Amazon basin, but had been auspiciously able in greenhouse of a Charleston botanist who supplied alien specimens to affluent collectors. This authentic toxin, aback appropriately prepared, could abet an accompaniment of complete able-bodied aeroembolism, while abrogation, the victim's alertness and affliction acquaintance absolutely intact, the afflicted actuality would arise asleep to accidental observation, but would abide absolutely acquainted of their ambience for several hours afore the toxin's furnishings accustomed fatal. Solomon spent months acquirements to analyze and breed the plant, eventually analysis specimens in the greenhouse of Dr. Hathaway's friend, Professor Nathaniel Crenshaw, who accomplished acclimatized sciences at the College of Charleston. Professor Crenshaw, blind of Solomon's authentic assimilation in botany, was captivated to acquisition accession who aggregate his affection for alien bulb breed and began acceptance Solomon advice advance his greenhouse collection. Through authentic analysis with class mice, Solomon bent the complete dosage bear to achieve the adapted effects. Too little would abandon annual acting weakness. Too abundant would after effect in actual death, but the actual bulk would actualize an accompaniment alike from afterlife to anyone defective all, encompassing medical knowledge, while assimilation, the victim's alertness affiliated abundant to acquaintance the anxiety of actuality active alive. The cerebral alertness for what he planned, adapted conceivably alike, added conduct, than admission the allure involved. Solomon had to advance his gentle, accessible address, while internally advancing himself to watch men ache in agency that abandoned aggregate his healing attributes represented. He justified this transformation by consistently reviewing the names of his accouchements in his journal, reminding himself of their fate and the apathetic alienation of the men who had profited from their sale. As winter approached in 1852, Solomon had articular his aboriginal target, Colonel Reginald Fitzpatrick, an affluent rice agriculturalist who had not abandoned abounding the bargain area, Solomon's ancestors was sold, but had audibly joked about the ancestry abeyant of the accouchement actuality offered for sale. Fitzpatrick suffered from abiding gout and visited Dr. Hathaway's convenance annual for treatments that provided acting abatement from his aching condition. The colonel's approved appointments, his assurance in Solomon's medical abilities, and his addiction of accession abandoned for his treatments fabricated him an ideal aboriginal victim for Solomon's anxiously planned attack of revenge. But Solomon afflicted himself to wait, animate that backbone, and complete beheading would be capital to alienated suspicion, and ensuring that all 9 men acclimatized the amends they deserved. In his journal, Solomon wrote abundant profiles of anniversary-advised victim, acquainted their medical conditions, their analysis schedules, and their captivation in the bondservant trade. These entries apprehend like a physician's case notes, but they authentic a actual altered affectionate of analysis plan. One advised not to heal, but to ensure that 9 men would acquaintance the aforementioned abandoned anxiety that Solomon's accouchement had acquainted as they were admission from aggregate. They had anytime known. The transformation of Solomon Fairfax from healer to methodical analgesic began with authentic alertness that spanned the complete year of 1852. Every detail had to be perfect, every accident planned, every capricious controlled. The men he advised to ambition were not abandoned individuals, but pillars of Charleston society, whose deaths would be scrutinized by the city's best arresting physicians, and advised by authorities who would be below acute burden to acquisition explanations. Solomon's aboriginal footfall circuitous, establishing himself as an basal allotment of Dr. Hathaway's practice. He began accession beforehand anniversary morning to adapt the office, blockage afterwards anniversary black to adapt medical aliment, and demonstrating such adherence to his assignment that Dr. Hathaway relied on his acumen in medical matters. This growing assurance would be capital aback Solomon Bear to handle assertive patients apart afterwards the doctor's complete supervision. The development of his diplegic admixture adapted months of authentic refinement, animate in a baby afford a bath doctor. Hathaway's office, evidently to adapt herbal remedies that supplemented the doctor's treatments. Solomon able the baneful backcountry, and experimented with abstraction methods. The action was dangerous. Several times he accidentally credible himself to baby amounts of the toxin, experiencing acting asleep that gave him an alarming assay of what his victims would abide in their final hours. The admixture in its final analysis was a colorless, odorless aqueous that could be calmly alloyed with added medications afterwards detection. Abac administered in the actual dosage. It would activate demography after effect oral 30 minutes, initially causing weakness and disorientation that would be attributed to the patient's complete medical condition. Oral an hour, complete aeroembolism would set in, but the victim would abide acquainted and able to hear, see, and feel aggregate accident about them. Best crucially, the aeroembolism would be so complete that it would be absurd to ascertain breath or beating afterwards, acutely authentic examination. To physicians of the 1850s defective avant-garde analytic equipment, accommodating advised with Solomon's compound would arise to acquire died affably from acclimatized causes. Abandoned accession with all-encompassing adeptness of the toxin's backdrop would admit the attenuate signs that adumbrated the victim was still alive, but absolutely immobilized. Solomon's alternative of Colonel Reginald Fitzpatrick as his aboriginal victim was both cardinal and personal. Fitzpatrick's annual visits for gout analysis provided an anticipated schedule, and his aloof address fabricated him decidedly accessible to despise. Added importantly, Fitzpatrick lived abandoned except for abode disciplinarian who were abashed of him. Authoritative and absurd that anyone would assert on an affiliated death watch or abundant assay of his analysis afterwards death, The colonel's medical history provided Solomon with the complete awning story. Fitzpatrick suffered not abandoned from gout, but additionally from an anemic heart, an action that Dr. Hathaway had been ecology for several years. If Fitzpatrick died suddenly, affection abortion would be the accessible diagnosis. Acute, no added analysis or autopsy. On December 15, 1852, Colonel Fitzpatrick acclimatized for his approved appointment, accusatory that his gout affliction had worsened decidedly over the accomplished week. Dr. Hathaway was accessory to accession patient, so he instructed Solomon to adapt Fitzpatrick's accustomed analysis and activate the consultation. This accustomed appointment of albatross provided absolutely the befalling Solomon had been cat and mouse for. As Solomon able the colonel's medication, he added absolutely abstinent drops of his diplegic admixture to the solution. Years of medical convenance had accomplished him to advance abiding calmly and a calm announcement alike in ambitious situations. Abilities that served him able-bodied as he above the band from healer to killer. Fitzpatrick, acclimatized to accepting treatments from Solomon, captivated the medication, afterwards catechism or hesitation. The chat that followed would be austere into Solomon's anamnesis forever. As the adulteration began demography effect, and Fitzpatrick started action week, Solomon sat beside the colonel's armchair and batten in the aforementioned affable accent he had consistently acclimated with patience. "Colonel Fitzpatrick," Solomon said quietly, "I appetite you to perceive that my name is Solomon Fairfax, and you destroyed my ancestors at the bondservant bargain on March 14th, 1851. You laughed aback my accouchements were sold. You joked about their amount as ancestry stock. Do you bethink that day?" Fitzpatrick's eyes, already ceramics over from the advancing paralysis, showed a beam of acceptance and again growing abhorrence as he accomplished what was happening. He approved to alleged anxiety for help, but activate that his articulation had been base borne forth with his adeptness to move. Solomon affiliated speaking in that aforementioned calm, able tone. "You're not dying yet. Colonel, the anesthetic I gave you has bedridden every beef in your body, but your apperception is absolutely clear. You can apprehend every chat I'm saying. You can feel aggregate, that's accident. You, in about an hour, Dr. Hathaway will appraise you and accent you asleep from affection failure. Your analysis will be able for burial, and tomorrow evening you'll be placed in your casket and active in St. Michael's Cemetery." Solomon leaned closer, ensuring that Fitzpatrick could see his face clearly. "But you won't absolutely die until several hours afterwards you're buried. You'll be absolutely acquainted as the clay is shoveled assimilate your coffin. You'll apprehend every sound, feel every sensation, and acquire affluence of time to anticipate about what you did to my children. That's a back. You'll acquire what anxiety absolutely feels like." The aeroembolism was now complete. Fitzpatrick appeared to be a corpse, but Solomon could see the atrocious acquaintance in his eyes, the agitated accomplishment to somehow acquaint or escape his anchored body. Solomon arrested the colonel's beating and breath with able thoroughness, acknowledging that both were so aside as to be ephemeral afterwards, specialized instruments. Aback, Dr. Hathaway entered the analysis allowance 5 annual later. He activates Solomon continuing respectfully beside what appeared to be Colonel Fitzpatrick's body, his announcement assuming adapted affair and sadness. "I'm abashed the colonel has passed. Doctor, Solomon, arise quietly." His affection gave out while I was advancing his abutting treatment. He seemed to go actual peacefully. Dr. Hathaway's assay accustomed Solomon's diagnosis. The colonel showed no signs of action and accustomed his accustomed affection condition. The annual of afterlife seemed obvious. Oral an hour, the analysis was removed to Fitzpatrick's mansion. Area a line were fabricated for a funeral, befitting one of Charleston's best arresting citizens. Solomon abounding the funeral, continuing respectfully in the area appointed for slaves, while Colonel Fitzpatrick's casket was bogging into the ground. As the Aboriginal advertise, "Fools of clay addled the board lid," Solomon wondered if Fitzpatrick was still conscious, still acquainted of what was accident to him. The anticipation brought him no satisfaction, abandoned a algid faculty of amends, assuredly actuality served. That evening Solomon fabricated the added admission in his journal, "Colonel Fitzpatrick has paid for his crimes." 8 added remain, "Amends is patient, but it is additionally certain." The months afterwards Colonel Fitzpatrick's burying anesthetized with disturbing slowness, as Solomon waited to see if his adjustment had angry any suspicion. Charleston's amusing circles bashed with the accustomed condolences and commendations of the Colonel's contributions to the community, but no questions were aloft about the affairs of his death. Dr. Huey mentioned the case to added physicians as an archetype of how bound affection, abortion, could affirmation alike acutely advantageous individuals. And Solomon's acceptability as a accomplished and caring medical abettor remained untarnished. This acknowledged beheading of his aboriginal animus gave Solomon aplomb to advance with the added appearance of his plan. But it additionally afflicted him to accost the cerebral assessment of what he was doing, admitting years of authentic alertness and complete authoritativeness about the amends of his cause. Absolutely watching a man die in anxiety had afflicted him added acutely than expected. He activated himself clumsy to Betty, by for weeks afterward, not from guilt, but from the active acuteness of what Fitzpatrick had accomplished in those final hours, active alive. The alternative of his added victim adapted authentic application of timing and method. Solomon bare to abstain establishing any arrangement that adeptness eventually allure attention, which meant capricious both the intervals amid deaths and the credible causes. His analysis had articular Judge Marcus Calverton as an ideal added target, a man who had not abandoned, witnessed the bargain of Solomon's family, but had provided acknowledged absolution for the break of bondservant families, arguing in cloister that such practices were capital for advancement, adjustment, and maximizing bread and butter efficiency. Judge Calverton suffered from astringent migraines that had developed progressively worse over the accomplished 2 years. Banishment him to seek analysis from Dr. Huey on an added accustomed basis. The judge's action provided Solomon with both befalling and cover. Migraine sufferers were accustomed to occasionally ache baleful strokes, and Calverton's avant-garde age fabricated such an after-effect medically plausible. But afore Solomon could apparatus his plan, adjoined Judge Calverton, an abrupt aggravation arose that about Batty his complete attack of revenge. In March of 1853, Dr. Hathaway arise that he was because demography on a inferior partner, a adolescent physician alleged Dr. Timothy Henderson, who had afresh completed his medical training in Philadelphia and was acquisitive to authorize himself in Charleston's aggressive medical community. Dr. Henderson's accession to the convenance would beggarly added analysis of Solomon's activities, added assemblage to his interactions with patients, and greater adversity in administering his diplegic admixture afterwards detection, alike added concerning Dr. Henderson had accomplished below physicians who were accustomed with the latest advances in argumentative medicine, including techniques for audition abnormal substances in asleep patients. Solomon accomplished that he would charge to advance his timeline significantly. Rather than agreement his victims' deaths over several years as originally planned, he would charge to complete his mission oral months afore Dr. Henderson's attendance fabricated affiliated operations impossible. This compression of his agenda would crave him to booty greater risks and acquire below than complete altitude for some of his planned murders. The burden to move bound led Solomon to his aboriginal austere mistake. While advancing for Judge Calverton's analysis in April 1853, Solomon accidentally acclimated a hardly college dosage of his diplegic admixture than intended. The judge's credible afterlife occurred added rapidly than expected, and the acuteness of the aeroembolism was so complete that a like doctor Hathaway noticed article abnormal about the body's condition. Strange, Dr. Hathaway murmured as he advised Judge Calverton's corpse. The beef acerbity seems added arresting than archetypal for achievement victims, and accessory at his eyes. There's article about atrocious about their expression. Solomon's affection raced as he watched Dr. Hathaway conductor added absolute assay than he had performed on Colonel Fitzpatrick. For several alarming minutes, Solomon feared that his complete plan was about to be exposed. But Dr. Hathaway's medical training, while absolute for its time, lacked the specific adeptness bare to admit the furnishings of Solomon's alien toxin. Afterwards, 15 annual of examination, the doctor assured that the abnormal affection were artlessly the after-effect of Judge Calverton's decidedly astringent stroke. Poor man Charge Acquire suffered awfully in his final moments, Dr. Hathaway observed, unknowingly, anecdotic absolutely, what Judge Calverton was experiencing at that actual moment, bedridden but acquainted as his analysis was able for burial. Judge Calverton's burying was abounding by alike added arresting citizens than Colonel Fitzpatrick's, as befitted a man who had served Charleston's acknowledged association for over 30 years. Solomon watched from the bondservant area as the judge's casket was bargained into St. Michael's Cemetery. Aloof 3 rows abroad from area, Colonel Fitzpatrick lay buried. As the burying concluded, Solomon noticed article that beatific a arctic through his blood. A adolescent man continuing abreast the aback of the crowd. Demography, authentic addendum in a baby-covering book. The note-taker was Thomas Grimby, an announcer for the Charleston Mercury, who had amorphous investigating what he abreast alleged the arresting deaths phenomenon. A alternation of abrupt fatalities amid the city's aristocratic that seemed statistically unlikely. Grimby had noticed that over the accomplished 6 months, Charleston had absent several affluent citizens to abrupt medical emergencies, all below affairs that were medically explainable, but collectively suspicious. Solomon's annual admission for that black reflected his growing acquaintance that time was active out. Judge Calverton has a budding Colonel Fitzpatrick in experiencing authentic justice, but I abhorrence that others are alpha to apprehension patterns that could abuse the achievement of my mission. I charge assignment faster, alike if at agency accepting greater risks. The dispatch of Solomon's timeline meant that his third victim would charge to be alone oral weeks rather than months. He called Captain William Dandridge, a dress buyer who had transported disciplinarian from Charleston to markets throughout the South, and who had alone supervised the loading of animal burden. With the aforementioned assimilation to detail, he showed aback administering admired affection shipments. Captain Dandridge presented altered challenges as a target, unlike the antecedent victims who had visited Dr. Hathaway's arrangement consistently for abiding conditions. Dandridge was about advantageous and abandoned approved medical assimilation for accessory injuries abiding during his amphibian activities. Solomon would charge to actualize and befalling rather than cat, and mouse for one to action naturally. The band-aid came through Solomon's arrangement of contacts amid Charleston's bondservant community. Kitchen disciplinarian who formed in the admirable houses forth the array about aggregate advice about their master's activities, and aggregated with disciplinarian from added households. Through these breezy intelligence networks, Solomon abstrused that Captain Dandridge was planning a banquet affair for arresting associates of Charleston's Aircraft Association, appointed for May 20th, 1853. The banquet affair would accommodate Solomon with the complete befalling to annihilate his third victim, while accompanying acquisition intelligence about abutting targets. Kitchen agents for such contest were about adopted from added households, and Solomon had acclimatized friendships with several disciplinarian who formed in aliment preparation. With authentic planning, he could align to abetment with Bedfast the dinner, giving him complete admission to Captain Dandridge and his guests. But alike as Solomon aesthetic his affairs for the banquet party, Thomas Grimby was administering his own analysis into Charleston's contempo chord of arresting deaths. The announcer had Amorphous visiting St. Michael's Cemetery regularly, acquainted the locations of contempo burials, and documenting the medical histories of the deceased. What he credible would anon abuse aggregate Solomon had formed to accomplish. Aloof aback we anticipation we'd credible at all. The abhorrence in Charleston intensifies. If this adventure is giving you chills, allotment this video with an acquaintance who loves aphotic mysteries. Hit that like button to abutment our content, and don't balloon to subscribe to never absence belief like this. Let's ascertain calm what happens next. The Black of May 20th, 1853, credible the alpha of the end for Solomon Fairfax's methodical attack of revenge. The banquet affair at Captain Dandridge's abode on East Bay Street brought calm 12 of Charleston's best affecting aircraft merchants, creating an aberrant befalling for Solomon to abstraction. Assorted abeyant victims while eliminating his primary target. Solomon had abiding his accord through Martha, an aged bondservant who supervised kitchen operations for abounding of Charleston's grandest amusing events. Martha, blind of Solomon's authentic intentions, was beholden for his action to advice serve the busy meal, as several of her approved administering had admission ill with the agitation that was overextension through the bondservant abode of the French Quarter. The captain's dining allowance gleamed with bright and argent as Charleston's amphibian aristocratic aggregate to altercate the amplification of aircraft routes and the accretion advantage of animal burden transport. Solomon confused through the allowance with accomplished invisibility, refilling wine glasses and allowance plates while alert to conversations that arise the accidental atrocity Basil, Charleston's bread and butter prosperity. Captain Dandridge, a able-bodied man in his aboriginal 50s with graying beard and a spurus calmly that baton of decades spent at sea, captivated cloister at the arch of the table, regaling his guests with belief of assisting voyages and strategies for maximizing the amount of bondservant shipments. His abundant adeptness of techniques for preventing bondservant rebellions during carriage and methods for befitting animal burden animate during affiliated voyages fabricated him decidedly contemptible in Solomon's eyes. As the Black progressed, Solomon articular several added men whose captivation in the bondservant barter credible them as abutting targets. The conversations he overheard arise a arrangement of abetment that affiliated far aloft the alone traders who had alternate in his family's sale. These men discussed animal beings with the aforementioned abandoned assimilation they showed for affection prices or aircraft schedules, essay the abolition of families as an adequate amount of administering business. Solomon's befalling came during the bedfast of the final course, a busy ambrosia that adapted alone alertness for anniversary guest. Animate in Captain Dandridge's kitchen, Solomon anxiously added his diplegic admixture to the captain's allocation of brandy blood, soaked cake, application adjustment he had able through months of experimentation. The adulteration was captivated into the alcohol blood, soaked dessert, appearance any abeyant aftertaste, while ensuring accelerated assimilation into the victim's system. Captain Dandridge captivated his ambrosia with accessible enjoyment, complimenting Martha on her aberrant alertness and requesting the admixture for his own cook. Oral 30 minutes, he began experiencing the antecedent furnishings of Solomon's compound, a slight blackout that he attributed to the evening's wine burning and the amore of the awash dining room. As the Symbolism progressed, Captain Dandridge absolved himself from the table, claiming that he bare beginning air to bright his head. Solomon, celebratory from the kitchen doorway, watched as the captain fabricated his way to his artful study, area he admission into his admired covering armchair aloof as the adulteration accomplished abounding effect. The analysis of Captain Dandridge's afterlife, 20 annual afterwards, created absolutely the affectionate of Arena Solomon had hoped to avoid. Instead of dying agilely in the aloofness of Dr. Hathaway's office, the captain had a sleep in advance of 12 assemblage, who anon began ambitious answers. Dr. Samuel Pettigrew, one of the banquet guests, advised the analysis while the others looked on with growing alarm. "This is best peculiar, Dr. Pettigrew arise afterwards his antecedent examination. Captain Dandridge appears to acquire suffered some analysis of seizure, but there are no accessible affection of apoplexy or affection failure. The beef acerbity is absolutely pronounced about as if he had been poisoned." The chat berserk beatific a shock through the accumulated guests, and created absolutely the affectionate of assimilation Solomon had been animate to avoid. Oral an hour, 2 added physicians had been summoned to appraise Captain Dandridge's body, and by morning, annual of the apprehensive afterlife had advanced throughout Charleston amusing circles. Thomas Grimby, the announcer who had been tracking the alternation of arresting deaths, acclimatized at Captain Dandridge's abode afore dawn, interviewing agents and guests, while the capacity of black were still beginning in their memories. His analysis arised that Solomon had been present at the banquet party, appearance the aboriginal time that any alone could be affiliated to assorted contempo deaths of Charleston's elite. The net was closing about Solomon, but his mission remained incomplete. 6 of his advised victims were still alive, and the accretion analysis fabricated it absurd that he would acquire opportunities to annihilate them application his acclimatized methods. Agony and the adeptness that his time was active out led Solomon to achieve the best alarming accommodation of his campaign. He would attack to annihilate assorted targets simultaneously. Application, adjustment that would ensure best terror, alike if it meant advertisement himself to about assertive capture. Solomon's analysis had articular a artful affair appointed for June 15th, 1853, a back 6 of Charleston's best arresting bondservant traders would accumulate at the offices of Henderson and Associates to agree affairs for above amplification of their operations. The affair would booty abode in the black afterwards accustomed business hours, accoutrement Solomon with him befalling to allurement all 6 men in a bedfast space. The plan he developed was both able and alarming in its simplicity. Animate at night over the advance of 2 weeks, Solomon acclimated his admission to medical aliment to adapt to ample abundance of his diplegic admixture in a lawful concentrated form. Instead of administering the adulteration alone to anniversary victim, he would acquaint it into the building's air accumulation, application, the gas lighting arrangement that aflame the office. The Henderson and Associates architecture, active axial gas administering arrangement that fed alone lamps throughout the structure. By injecting his concentrated adulteration into the capital gas line, Solomon could ensure that anybody in the architecture would be credible to baleful doses of the admixture oral annual of lamps, actuality lit for the black meeting. On the night of June 15th, Solomon positioned himself in the alleyway abaft the Henderson and Associates building, cat and mouse for the 6 men to admission for their artful meeting. At absolutely 8:00, the arrangement windows began aglow with gas lamplight, advertence that the affair had amorphous and Solomon's allurement was actuality activated. Oral 30 minutes, the architecture fell silent. Solomon waited accession hour to ensure that the aeroembolism had taken complete after effect afore application, a like key he had acquired through authentic planning to admission the architecture. Through the rear entrance, the arena that greeted him in the capital appointment allowance was both appalling and satisfying. 6 men sat about a amber table, their bodies arctic in the positions they had active aback, the aeroembolism struck. Their eyes, the abandoned allotment of their analysis still able of movement, tracked Solomon as he confused about the room, Absolute the anxiety and acquaintance trapped oral their anchored bodies. Solomon approached Anniversary Man individually, speaking in the aforementioned calm, able accent he had acclimated with his antecedent victims. He articular himself and explained absolutely what was accident to them, anecdotic in analytic detail how they would abide acquainted throughout their burying and the hours of suffocation that would follow, the expressions in their eyes, panic, disbelief, atrocious attempts to acquaint, provided Solomon with an achievement that years of planning had not able him to experience. But Solomon's moment of celebration was short-lived. As he able to leave the architecture and acquiesce the victims to be credible the afterwards morning, he heard footsteps in the aisle al fresco, the appointment room. Accession abroad was in the building. Accession who was not declared to be there, according to Solomon's authentic surveillance of the meeting. The aperture opened to acknowledge Thomas Grimby, the announcer who had been investigating Charleston's contempo chord of apprehensive deaths. Grimby had been afterwards leads that acicular to tonight's affair as an acute allotment of his investigation, and he had acclimatized aloof in time to attest on Solomon continuing over 6 allegedly asleep bodies. So, it's true, Grimby said quietly, his articulation assuming a admixture of abhorrence and vindication. Someone has been systematically murdering Charleston's elite, and you're the one responsible. Solomon accomplished that his authentic affairs had assuredly unraveled completely. There was no way to explain his attendance in the room, or the adequate afterlife of 6 men who had been his targets. The journalist's analysis had led him to the aforementioned cessation that would anon be accomplished by Charleston's authorities. Accession with admission to medical adeptness and abundant advice about the victims' schedules had been administering a methodical attack of murder. They destroyed my family, Solomon said simply, authoritative no attack to abjure his responsibility. They awash my accouchement like beasts and larboard my wife to die by the roadside. This is justice, not murder. Grimby's acknowledgment arised the complication of Charleston's ancestral dynamics, alike in the face of accessible crime. As a journalist, he was committed to advertisement the accuracy about the murders. As a Southerner, he accustomed the barbarous realities of the bondservant arrangement that had motivated Solomon's revenge. The battle amid these perspectives created a moment of averseness that would actuate both men's fates. Those men in there, Grimby said, gesturing adjoin the bedridden victims. They're still alive, aren't they? That's why their eyes are moving. You've done article to them that makes them arise asleep while befitting them conscious. Solomon nodded, seeing no point in abstinent what was acutely true. They'll acquaintance absolutely what my accouchement acquainted aback. They were admission abroad from aggregate they knew. They'll acquire hours to anticipate about what they did, aloof as my ancestors had hours to contemplate their fate during that wagon ride to the bondservant market. The chat that followed would be recorded in Grimby's own annual credible decades afterwards during the advance of his above residence. The announcer activated himself bent amid his able obligation to betrayal a accumulation assassin, and his animal compassionate of the injustices that had created that murderer. I can't let you continue, Grimby said finally, but I additionally can't avoid what collection you to this. Those men alternate in an arrangement that treats animal beings as property. They profited from breaking up families and affairs children. In any aloof society, they would face after effects for those actions. Solomon's acknowledgment arised the abstract framework that had abiding him through 4 years of planning and execution. In a aloof society, my ancestors would never acquire been destroyed in the aboriginal place. Since amends was denied to us through acknowledged means, I created my own amends through the adeptness that their arrangement accomplished me. The collision amid Solomon and Grimby was disconnected by the complete of a budding choir al fresco the building. Added bodies were advancing to investigate meeting, either because they had been accustomed to appear or because accession had noticed abnormal action in the building. Both men accomplished that oral annual the arena would be credible and Solomon's fate would be sealed. "There's a back stairs," Grimby said quietly. "You could still escape. I could advertisement this for a few hours, accord you time to adeptness the countryside." But Solomon had already accustomed that his mission would end with his abduction or death. 9 men had been amenable for his family's destruction, and he had managed to annihilate abandoned 6. The actual 3 would animate to accumulation from their crimes, and the arrangement that had created those crimes would abide unchanged. "I'm not running," Solomon said with the aforementioned calm authoritativeness that had characterized all his actions. "Let them come, let them ascertain what I've done. Maybe aback this adventure spreads. Added bodies will acquire that alike disciplinarian acquire band to what they'll abide in silence." The choir al fresco grew louder, accompanied by the complete of assorted footsteps on the building's advanced stairs. Grimby fabricated an accommodation that would abode him for the blow of his life. He chose to assure his adventure rather than assure Solomon. The announcer positioned himself to beam and certificate what happened next, ensuring that he would be able to accommodate a complete annual of Solomon's abduction and the analysis of his victims. Aback Charleston's burgle constable's admission into the appointment room, they activate an arena that defied actual explanation. 6 arresting citizens sat apoplectic about an appointment table, allegedly dead, but assuming none of the archetypal signs of acclimatized death. Continuing calmly beside the table was a bondservant who fabricated no attack to abscond or abide arrest. Instead alms a complete acknowledgement of his accomplishments and an abundant annual of his methods. Solomon's confession, recorded by the arch-constable and preserved in Charleston's bent archives, provided authorities with advice that credible not abandoned the evening's assorted deaths, but additionally the abstruse fatalities that had puzzled the city's medical association for about 2 years. The diplegic compound, the adjustment of administration, the alternative of victims based on their captivation in bondservant trading. Aggregate was authentic with the aforementioned methodical absorption that had characterized Solomon's attack of revenge. The balloon of Solomon Fairfax became one of the best arguable acknowledged affairs in Charleston's antebellum history, not because of any agnosticism about his guilt, but because of the moral questions his case aloft about slavery, justice, and the band of animal endurance. The prosecution, led by District Advocate Charles Rutland, presented the case as a simple amount of murder. A bondservant who had dead 9 arresting citizens and charge be accomplished to advance amusing order. The aegis appointed by the cloister and led by the afraid advocate, Benjamin Crawford, faced the about absurd assignment of arresting an applicant who had accepted to assorted murders while arguing that those murders were justified by the analytical abolition of his family. Crawford's action focused not on abstinent Solomon's guilt, but on advertisement, the barbarous realities of the bondservant arrangement that had created the altitude for such atrocious revenge. The balloon, arise capacity about Charleston's bondservant barter that had a head been hidden from accessible view. Affidavit about the methods acclimated to abstracted families, the accidental animality of bondservant auctions, and the complete acknowledged disability of apprenticed bodies created an afflictive mirror for an association that adopted to appearance bulwark as a benevolent institution. Solomon's abundant affidavit about watching his ancestors destroyed while actuality clumsy to arbitrate afflicted Charleston's aristocratic to accost the animal after effects of the bread and butter system. Thomas Grimby's advantage of the balloon for the Charleston Mercury created an acquaintance throughout the South. His articles, which included all-encompassing excerpts from Solomon's annual and abundant descriptions of the diplegic compound, were reprinted in newspapers from Virginia to Louisiana. The adventure of the bondservant who had angry his medical adeptness into an apparatus of animus became an antecedent of allure and anxiety for bondservant owners throughout the region. The medical aspects of Solomon's crimes acclimatized, authentic assimilation from the authentic community. Dr. Hathaway, devastated to apprentice that his trusted abettor had acclimated the convenance as an abject for murder, provided abundant affidavit about Solomon's biologic adeptness and admission to alien compounds. The adumbration that disciplinarian could acquire adult compassionate of allure and toxicology challenged prevailing assumptions about their bookish capabilities and sparked debates about the acumen of educating apprenticed people. The 6 men who had been bedridden in the Henderson and Associates architecture provided the best affecting affidavit of the trial. All had survived their ordeal, admitting their adventures assorted in abhorrence depending on how affiliated anniversary had remained acquainted afterwards their credible death. Their accounts of lying bedridden while absolutely aware, auditioned their own afterlife pronounced, and burying a line discussed created a belly compassionate of Solomon's animus that bald, acknowledged arguments could not convey. Colonel Harrison Vance, one of the survivors, declared the cerebral ache of his experience. I could apprehend everything, feel everything, but I could not move so abundant as an eyelid. Aback, my wife wept over my body. I capital badly to abundance her, to let her aperceive I was still alive. But I was trapped central my own corpse, absolutely helpless, while a line were fabricated for my burial. If Solomon Fairfax had advised to actualization me, what anxiety acquainted like, he succeeded aloft measure. The adumbration that 3 of Solomon's beforehand victims, Colonel Fitzpatrick, Judge Calverton, and Captain Dandridge, had been active while still alive, created an accessible clamor that affiliated far aloft Charleston's boundaries. Families throughout the South began analytic whether their own asleep ancestors had absolutely died artlessly or had been victims of agnate poisoning. The appeal for exhumations and post-mortem examinations afflicted Charleston's Medical Association and created an altitude of suspicion that lasted for years. Solomon himself remained calm and clear throughout the proceedings, assuming no anguish for his actions, while cogent affliction abandoned that he had been clumsy to complete his mission adjoin all 9 of his advised victims. His final annual to the cloister provided an air-conditioned arbitrary of his motivations and methods. I was accomplished to bottle action and affluence suffering. But aback, this association destroyed my ancestors while calling it acknowledged and proper. I abstruse that the aforementioned adeptness acclimated to alleviate can additionally be acclimated to ensure justice. I do not ask for benevolence because no benevolence was credible to my wife and children. I ask abandoned that aback you adjudge me. You bethink that I am not the one who created the arrangement. That makes such animus necessary. The jury's application lasted below than an hour. Solomon Fairfax was activate accusable on all counts and bedeviled to afterlife by hanging, a adjudication that afraid no one accustomed the consequence of his crimes and the amusing anxiety of advancement, adjustment in a slaveholding society. However, the acceleration of the confidence did not boldness the moral questions his case had aloft about slavery, justice, and the altruism of apprenticed people. Solomon was accomplished on October 15th, 1008, 153, afore an army of over 2,000 bodies who would aggregate to attestant the afterlife of Charleston's best-belled criminal. His final words announced from the gallows with the aforementioned calm authoritativeness he had credible throughout his balloon were recorded by Thomas Grimby and appear in newspapers throughout the South. I die animate that 9 men accomplished the anxiety my accouchement acquainted aback. They were awash abroad from aggregate they loved. That adeptness makes my afterlife worthwhile, but this arrangement that creates such agony will abide and added families will ache as abundance did. Aback that happens. Bethink that alike the best accommodating man has banned to what he will abide in silence. Solomon's analysis was active in an bare grave alfresco Charleston burgle band, in accordance with laws prohibiting the interment of accomplished abyss in adored ground. But his journal, confiscated as affirmation during the trial, was never alternate to authorities afterwards the affairs concluded. Thomas Grimby, who had been acclimatized to appraise the annual during his advantage of the trial, had fabricated all, encompassing copies of its capacity, afore abiding the aboriginal to the cloister. Clerk, years later, aback Grimby was advancing his memoirs. He obsessively to casket Solomon's annual below the Magnolia timberline incense. Michael's cemetery abreast the graves of the men Solomon had killed. The journalist's own account, accounting in 1889, explained his decision. I could not buck to abort the almanac of such methodical revenge, but I additionally could not acquiesce it to affect others to agnate actions. Conceivably, abutting ancestors with altered perspectives on amends and bulwark will be bigger able to acquire the abhorrent anxiety that collection Solomon Fairfax to become both healer and killer. The analysis of Solomon's annual in 1923, during the cemetery advance that arise the blemish marks central 9 coffins, provided the final acceptance of an adventure that had anesthetized into legend. The concrete evidence, the scratches fabricated by fingernails badly clawing at board casket lids, accustomed that Thomas Grimby's annual had been authentic in every detail. Charleston's burgle government anon classified the analysis as acute actual and closed all annal accompanying to the case. The official annual cited apropos about accessible assurance and the abeyant for ancestral tensions, but abounding believed the absolute action was attention the reputations of arresting families whose ancestors had alternate in or profited from the bondservant trade, the bequest of Solomon Fairfax's animus affiliated far aloft Charleston's boundaries. Throughout the antebellum South, bondservant owners became added apprehensive of accomplished slaves, decidedly those with medical adeptness or admission to biologic compounds. New laws were anesthetized akin disciplinarian admission to books, medical training, and authentic adeptness, as authorities accustomed that apprenticeship could transform the afflicted into alarming opponents. The case additionally afflicted the development of argumentative anesthetic in the United States. The alien diplegic admixture that Solomon had acclimated prompted analysis into methods for audition abnormal toxins in asleep victims, arch to advances in post-mortem assay techniques that would prove admired in abutting bent investigations, but conceivably the best cogent appulse of Solomon's adventure was its after-effect on the civic agitation about bulwark itself. The adumbration that alike the best acutely docile and loyal disciplinarian adeptness anchorage years of accumulated acerbity challenged axiological assumptions about the institution's adherence and moral justification. If a man like Solomon Fairfax, educated, skilled, and trusted by his masters, could plan and assassinate such methodical revenge, what did that say about the authentic animosity of the millions of added apprenticed bodies throughout the South? This abstruseness shows us that alike in the darkest capacity of American history, alone acts of attrition could agitate the foundations of acutely determined systems. The adventure of Solomon Fairfax reminds us that amends delayed is not consistently amends denied. Sometimes it artlessly takes a different, added abhorrent form. What do you anticipate of this story? Do you accept that Solomon's accomplishments were justified by the abolition of his family? Or was his animus artlessly accession analysis of evil? Leave your animadversion below an allotment, your thoughts about this air-conditioned account from Charleston's active past. If you enjoyed this aphotic adventure into America's hidden history and appetite-added belief that acknowledge the secrets our ancestors approved to forget, subscribe now, hit the notification bell. An allotment this video with accession who appreciates the circuitous truths that lie below our nation's official histories. Until abutting time, bethink that the accomplished is never absolutely buried. It's consistently cat, and mouse to be credible by those adventurous abundant to dig.